Welcome to Last Orders, a Spike podcast. This is the show all about freedom, the nanny state, and anything else that's in the news. In this episode, we discuss Will Smith and Chris Rock, the cost of living crisis, cheap meat, and the Batley Grammar scandal. Hello and welcome to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater and I'm joined, as I am in every episode, by Chris Snowdon from the IEA. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Tom. Great to be here, as ever.
So upbeat today. And we're delighted to be joined by returning guest to the show, Spike's chief political writer, Brendan O'Neill.
Hello.
So we've got a lot to get into today, but it's been just over a month since we last did this, and the world has changed forever, really. We should really probably address the biggest story in the world right now. It's changed the course of history. It's forced people the world over to take sides. And that, of course, is Will Smith slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars. Brendan, it's become a huge story. I mean, it's birthed 1,000 takes in every different direction. What do you make of all of it? Are you Team Rock? Are you Team Smith?
Oh, I am massively Team Rock. But it's a funny story in some ways because in one sense, it's a really normal thing to have happened. I mean, there are people up and down the land who get smacked every day in a pub for taking the mick out of someone's wife. I mean, these things happen. So it's perfectly normal. And there is an argument to be made that Will Smith was doing something that blokes do all the time, which is wallop someone for saying something rude about their partner. But the context of it, the context of in which it took place and the response to it make it something really, really fascinating, grimly fascinating in the era of the culture wars. So the context of it, of course, is the Oscars. And this is the pinnacle event of Will Smith's industry. So he should have behaved himself and sat down and had a word with Chris Rock afterwards. But then there's the response to it. And I find the response to it absolutely hilarious and terrifying in equal measure. And the thing that has struck me most has been among the kind of woke set or whatever we're supposed to call these people, there has been a lot of sympathy for Will Smith from the kind of people who, you know, if a black man is waving a knife around and a policeman wrestles him to the ground, that is a completely unacceptable form of violent racist behavior. Whereas if a black man makes a offensive joke, which is what Chris Rock did, then it's perfectly legitimate to punch him in the face. So there's a real double standard. There's a real hypocrisy. But I think they are increasingly sanctioning violence as a response to offensive speech. And that's the kind of message I've got from this. So, you know, these are the kind of people who firstly said it's fine to punch a Nazi. Then they said it's fine to slap a TERF. Then they said it's fine to, you know, well, what did you expect to Charlie Hebdo if you take the mick out of Muhammad? You know, of course, you're going to be attacked for doing so. And now they're essentially saying, well, punching someone for making fun of your wife with an offensive joke is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And I think that is going to contribute to the cancellation culture, to the idea that there are certain things you can't say, to the notion that violence is a reasonable response to words. So it's a funny one because on the one hand, Will Smith did what loads of people do. But on the other hand, the institutionalization of it as something that is understandable and almost even positive, I think that could have negative consequences.
Chris, what do you make of all this?
Well, I probably haven't thought about it quite as much as Brendan has. I saw it when I woke up on the morning after the Oscars, and I obviously watched the video, found it quite funny. I like Brendan, I'm on the side of Chris Rock just because I prefer him to the Fresh Prince anyhow. I mean, I quite like them both, but I like Chris Rock as a comedian. It was quite an edgy joke. But if you watch the comedy roastings they do in America, I mean, it wasn't anywhere near as savage as that. I was just struck by the fact that it's the first time I've seen anything from the Oscars that's kind of landed with me for such a long time. They seem to have a totally different venue for it now. And it was really close to the stage. Didn't they used to have an orchestra pit and all kinds of stuff going on there? It would look weird.
Cutbacks, you know.
And the other thing was, I had no idea they'd made a film about the Williams sisters' dad.
Yeah.
Why? I don't understand. Why? I don't know anything about him. I don't know
this was
anything
almost
about...
coming to you from a parallel universe, almost.
Yeah, because like the last film
Why
I
is the
saw,
Fresh Prince punching Chris Rock? What's this Williams sisters film?
The last film I saw was the last Star Wars film, and the last one before that was like the Alan Partridge film. So I do not see films very often at all.
You're just waiting on the Ronnie O'Sullivan biopic, and then
man, yeah,
just leave it.
Good. Well, if they can make one about Serena Williams' dad, I don't see why they can't make one about Ronnie. Genuinely, what is he still alive? Is he a goodie or a baddie? This guy, I don't know anything about him. but they made an Oscar-winning film now. About why there's a genuine question. What is so interesting about it?
I haven't seen it either.
I think he's a goodie, and he's seen as this heroic figure because he turned his two girls from these individuals who everyone else had low expectations of them, and then he turned them into these superstars. But what was striking about the Will Smith thing is that very striking, no pun intended, when he gave his speech very shortly after punching Chris Rock.
Funny too. Yeah.
What was funny about that is that he used Richard Williams, Serena and Venus's father, to justify the act of violence almost. Basically saying, like Richard, he plays Richard Williams, he says, like Richard, I
defend my family.
I defend my family. I'm obsessed with love. I react. I protect the people I love. And you just think, I'm sure Richard Williams is at home watching this or in the audience thinking, please stop doing this. But I thought in relation to the broader Oscars question, I mean, it is the first exciting thing that's happened at the Oscars for years and years and years. And I wonder if there are loads of people online saying it was staged. You know, there's this thing where everyone thinks
false
everything is staged. Absolutely, they're all over my Instagram page, driving me insane, saying, you idiot, this was staged, don't you see? So that's frustrating. But I do wonder if one of the unwitting consequences of it is that it has made the Oscars mildly interesting, which it hadn't been for a very long time.
Only this once. They're going to have to keep having a fight every year.
It's going to have to keep escalating.
They're going to escalate from a slap for a start. That was the other weird thing about it. It obviously wasn't a punch. It was initially reported by everybody as being a punch. And you watch it. No, it was. So was he literally pulling his punches? Do you think he was I don't want to...
It's kind of dismissive almost. It's like a sort of bitch slap situation.
Well, it was more like he should have had a glove in his hand. So
yeah, exactly.
I demand satisfaction, sir. That kind of thing. You know what I mean? That's what happens if someone disrespects your wife.
It's sort of honour culture. That was one of the things that made me laugh about some of the kind of conservative takes, particularly people in the US were saying, that's what I would have done. You know, this is a man standing up for his woman and all the rest of it. But if you want an avatar of traditional values, the Pinkett Smiths are not the ones to do it for. You know, he obviously doesn't like Chris Rock saying certain things about his wife, but what other men get up to with his wife doesn't seem to bother him nearly as much. But the other thing was, and Brendan, I take your points about this, but it did seem that the kind of woke response to it was just because they feel the need to have a response to absolutely everything. Like if there's anything in popular culture, society in general, any kind of viral moment, it has to have some sort of broader significance. Otherwise it didn't happen. Or it's what is that about, that we feel the need to kind of read into everything some expression of what we have always thought?
Usually, yeah, that's absolutely true. Everything gets folded into the culture wars instantaneously. As soon as it happens, people take sides. You're either on this side, that side. The old Brexit and Remain sides kick back into action in response to every event, seemingly. And of course, there's identity politics too. And it was very quickly racialized as well. So there was all this discussion about, the problem, because apparently Will Smith's wife has alopecia, which I didn't know. It's very possible Chris Rock didn't know. He was just taking the mick out of her because she had a shaved head at that moment, and she looked absolutely great with a shaved head. So there was lots of discussion about the importance of black women's hair and why you must never comment on it or make fun of it, and the importance of a black man demonstrating to the world that he will defend his woman. So it got racialized very swiftly. And that always happens these days. So I think that kind of impulse to racialize things, that impulse to turn everything into a culture war catfight, that really came through. But one of the great ironies, I think, for a lot of the kind of woke set who were standing up for Will Smith in a way that I just thought was very candid, as if he was some great warrior for black people and freedom more generally. I mean, the irony is that when I was young, a long time ago, Will Smith was always seen as really quite square and sad. I mean, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, everyone loved it and watched it after school and so on. But he was always juxtaposed to gangster rap, which was happening at the same time. And
the
he
Cosby
was actually
kids of rap.
Exactly. And he was always seen. He was always seen as really square and boring. And he was quite critical of gangster rap too. And in those days too, you fell down on one side or the other. So the idea that he is now emerging as this kind of great warrior for, respect for black women and the black community in general, it doesn't quite wash. But I do think the whole response to it is fascinating because it does demonstrate that tendency to racialize everything and to make everything a culture war fight when it doesn't really need to be.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue into the cost of living crisis. So we can talk about something a little bit more bread and butter. But so this is obviously rumbling on. There's so many different aspects to it, one of which being the kind of energy question. So this week we've had Rishi Sunak basically press the pause button, it sounds like, on this energy strategy, which the government had promised in early March. There's a lot of, apparently he's concerned about the cost of the nuclear portion of the policy and all the rest of it. But there's just not much of a sense, I think it's fair to say, Chris, about the government having much of a grip on this particular question. How are we going to get out of the soaring energy prices we have? Do they have a plan? I mean, what do you make of all this?
It can look, at some point, you just got to accept that the shit has hit the fan. There's nothing you can do. Really, I mean, you can try and compensate for people. You can cut fuel duty like Rishi has done. But in terms of averting disaster, there's not really anything you can do. We are paying the price now for a number of largely political decisions, particularly in terms of not having any energy security ourselves. And now I see the government is rushing to build nuclear power stations and is looking again at fracking. But these are long-term mistakes made by the government. They've also made mistakes in terms of, I would say, how much borrowing and money printing we've been doing for the last 20 years. But in addition to that, there's also been genuine, unforeseeable problems. The pandemic being one, and we can argue about the extent to which the government overreacted, but certainly it had to react in some way, and that had to involve borrowing. And then we had the Ukraine war, and if you want to show solidarity with Ukraine, old habits die hard, with Ukraine. And
you better pronounce Kyiv properly as well.
Kyiv, yeah. And if you agree with the sanctions, as I do, you have to accept you're going to take some pain for it. And people just aren't used to taking pain. They're not used to taking the responsibility for the consequences of their actions. We are £2.3 trillion in debt. We have been borrowing a colossal amount of money, not just for the last 2 years, but we borrowed a colossal amount of money during the time of the financial crisis. We then got into the recession, people saying we need to borrow more money so we don't have a deeper recession. We then got to Brexit, and it's like we need to borrow more money because Brexit had an effect on the pound and so on. But basically, there's always a crisis. This has gone on now for 15 years, of a perpetual sense of at least a perceived crisis. And the answer is always very loose monetary policy. And that in itself will lead to inflation. Inflation was 5% before the war started. This is not just about Russian gas by any means. We were America 7% in January before this. There was an inflation time bomb ticking away for various reasons, but very largely because the world economies have printed trillions of dollars over the course of the last two years. And so again, it comes down to accepting the consequences of the action. Did you like being paid to stay at home doing no work for months? Yeah. Do you like supporting Ukraine? Yeah. Okay. Well, you've got to pay for it. And so it's not like the government has a solution this time. The government has run out of options because the government's run out of money. We can only hope that there is peace between Russia and Ukraine as soon as possible. That will help enormously. But it takes many, many years to build a nuclear power station or get fracking. All this. There's no actual economic solution to this. And borrowing more money, you're just going to pour more printed money onto this fire. It can only get worse. The bottom line is very few people, I suspect, are going to get a pay rise of 7 or 8% this year. You'll be lucky if you get 4 or 5%, which is a real terms decline of 3% or so. Which apparently, just in itself, if everybody takes a pay cut of 3%, that's the biggest reduction in living standards since 1956 or something. I'm not sure what happened in 1956. Maybe that's when they started keeping records. I don't know. But this is what happens. This is the pernicious nature of inflation. It's the stealthiest and sneakiest and most pernicious of taxes, effectively. The government secretly quite likes it because it brings down the national debt. But yeah, there's no free lunch. We're paying for various decisions, right and wrong, over the course, not just of the last 2 years, but of the last 15.
Brendan, what's your take on all this?
I think the first thing is that the cost of living crisis is going to be incredibly serious. I mean, it's going to hit people really, really hard in a way that I think it's sometimes difficult to anticipate because, society lulls itself into a false sense of security sometimes. And everything seems quite comfortable. Everything seems quite nice. And I think it's going to hit us like a bit of a juggernaut. And that's going to be a bit of a shock to the system. And it's going to make some people's lives very difficult indeed. And I think there are a number of things going on here. Firstly, there are the two unforeseeable shocks we've had, as Chris mentioned. Firstly, the pandemic and the lockdown, which had and I agree that there are debates to be had about whether the lockdown was the right thing to do, whether it was the wrong thing to do, whether we should have had 3 or 4 of them or just one of them. All that stuff we can talk about for a long time. But it happened, and it had very serious economic consequences. And then, of course, there's the war in Ukraine, which is going to lead to price rises in certain foodstuffs and energy and so on. And that's having a knock-on effect too. So you have those two contemporary shocks to the system, which I think are going to exacerbate all the problems. But prior to those, you have all the pre-existing problems, which tend to be the stuff that people are less willing to talk about. People feel very comfortable talking about the fallout from lockdown. They feel comfortable talking about the fallout from Ukraine. And some people are even have this tendency to blame the energy crisis in particular on the war in Ukraine, which is actually quite deceptive. It didn't start with that war. But then prior to those two shocks to the system, you had two things. Firstly, you had just the inability of our government to get to grips with the economy and continue in downturn since the 1970s onwards, and a failure of government to grapple with those crises and really try to turn them around. And we've tended to stumble from one crisis to another. There have been moments of upward ticks, but generally it's been stumbling from crisis to crisis, and various governments have never got a handle on that problem. And then alongside that, you had the man-made energy crisis, where, due to various policy failures and the ideology of environmentalism, or the ideology that treated energy production as a problem in itself, something that was destructive, something that was not desirable, something that would have a terrible impact on nature. As a consequence of that man-made energy crisis, we've got the current energy crisis. And, when I hear people who have spent the past 20 years or so, including in debates with me and in discussions that Spiked has had with people, people who said, stop fracking, close all nuclear power stations, don't open that coal-fired power station because even though it will create 600 really well-paid jobs, it will destroy the local environment. When I hear those people now saying, oh dear, there's an energy crisis, what are we going to do? How are we going to wean ourselves off foreign energy? How are we going to get back on track? I really want to do a bit of a Will Smith wind. Onshore wind. And it's that incredibly frustrating. I think one of the things that's brought us to this situation is just a blinkered approach to policy. Yeah. Firstly, by eco-lunatics in government and downwards, who don't treat energy seriously, and also by governments who have failed to get on top of economic crises. And that blinkered stuff is really what we should focus on.
It's amazing on the energy stuff and the green policies in particular, because even the crises that we're in the midst of, and even war in Europe, has not been able to shake faith in net zero. I mean, across the continent, you hear the same argument made, which is net zero is our way out of this. It's insane. And then the announcements that are coming out from the government at the moment is they've had a kind of semi-conversion, as it were, on the question of nuclear power. They're a lot more enthusiastic about that than they used to be. But as you say, Chris, it takes a long time. But the other things you're hearing from them is that they're not going to lift the ban on fracking. There's still some interest in, again, bringing onshore wind back. And you just think it's like they're still just living in la-la land on these questions. But is it just because, as you were saying, Chris, there's no short-term payoff to doing the right thing where those things are concerned? It's not going to help Boris Johnson.
One of the big problems with democracy is the lack of short-term payoff for making good long-term decisions. That's why we've got £2.3 trillion of debt for a start, because it's always more tempting just to borrow another 100 billion here, because the worst that can happen is the voters will kick you out and somebody else have to look after the mess. And what they're going to do, they're just going to borrow more money too. So without very, very strong economic growth, which is the only answer here, and indeed investment in our own energy, but primarily very strong economic growth, we're going to suffer. But I have to say, we are not going to suffer anywhere near as much as some countries are. Okay, maybe our living standards go down by 3%. We're not talking about the 70s. It does feel like we're back in the 70s in lots of ways. We've got the blooming Cold War back. Russia's a major nuclear threat. We've got inflation, at not quite at 70s levels, but the highest level since the 70s, I think. But we are more than twice as wealthy as we were in the 1970s, right? We have a dip of 2 or 3% in our incomes. Of course, people are going to be hurt, and there's people at the tail of the income distribution who are going to be badly hurt. But we're still not living in the 1970s when 50% of the people didn't have an indoor toilet, what have you. The people it's really going to hurt are people in Africa, for example. Somalia, I think, it relies entirely on wheat from Ukraine. Yeah. Okay. Now, fertilizer prices have gone up 5-fold in the last year. This, again, is pre-Russia. Most of this stuff is pre-Russia. The effect of the lockdowns and the pandemic and people simply not producing as much stuff because people haven't been working as much and other reasons. But the bottom line is, and I've been warned about this by my dad, who's a farmer, for well over a year, fertilizer prices have gone through the roof. And of course, with these kind of costs, they don't feed through to the customer for quite a while. You've got to plant the stuff and wait months for it to grow, obviously, harvest it and then sell it on. What's a country like Somalia going to do if its basic foodstuffs go up 3, 4, 5-fold? We're talking famine. We're talking famine in Africa. Much worse than anything people in this country are going to see, because this is a worldwide problem. It's not just a matter of, well, we can't buy gas from Russia anymore in Britain. We hardly buy any gas from Russia in the first place. This is worldwide inflation affecting very, very fundamental commodities. And yes, the people at the bottom of the income distribution in this country are probably going to suffer worse because they always do. That's the nature of being at the bottom of the income distribution. But worldwide, the people at the bottom of the income distribution, which are literally billions of people, several billion people, potentially facing real catastrophe.
Hello, it's Tom here. I just want to quickly remind you all about Spiked supporters. This is our thriving donor community for those of you who give to Spiked regularly. So now those who give £5 or more each month or £50 or more each year can get exclusive perks. You can comment on articles, you can get discounts on all items in our shop, and you can get free and discounted tickets to Spiked events. So if you'd like to come along to any of our upcoming events, which we'll be announcing soon, and you're not already a Spiked supporter, then why not sign up today? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to find out more and to sign up. Once again, that's spiked-online.com/supporters. Thanks so much. And now on with the show. So Chris, just to bring it back to the UK for a second, I know you wanted to talk about this particular story, which seems to bring a lot of the cost of living issues that we've been talking about together with nanny state lunacy. So there was this headline in The Guardian recently, went around the internet, or at least our corner of it. UK supermarkets accused of bombarding shoppers with cheap meat. Could you tell us a bit more about this? Who's doing the accusing here?
I've stopped going into the supermarket because I'm so sick of being hit on the head by these people throwing cheap meat at me. I do want it, but I just feel I should pick it off the shelf in my trolley the old-fashioned way. It's very aggressive sales tactics in Tesco's these days. So yeah, they're bombarding people with cheap meat. Well, that's a terrible thing to be doing when inflation's kind of mounting towards double digits, isn't it? This is, it won't surprise you to hear, a bunch of NGOs, largely state-funded. The guy who runs the organisation, which I think is called Eating Better, he previously worked for an organisation called something like the 2040 Protein Challenge or something like that. It was all about getting people to eat more protein. You would think he'd be pro-cheap meat, wouldn't you, really? As the main source of protein for most people. But no, they don't like meat. They don't even like fish. And they want both fish and meat to be included in the government's forthcoming ban on bog-offs, buy one, get one frees, multi-buy promotions, which with terrible timing is due to come in October this year. Now, October this year is when the Office of Budget Responsibility expects inflation to peak at 8.7%. I'd take any of their predictions with a pinch of salt, but I think it's probably safe to say it will be at least that by October. So the government is bringing in a piece of legislation to make it more difficult to buy cheap food. This is it covers all so-called junk food high in fat, sugar and salt, and I believe they have exempted meat from this, presumably because they knew it would look absolutely absurd if they were banning adverts for roast lamb, for example, which technically is junk food under their definition. And these guys want them not only to include meat and fish into the scheme, but include all meat and fish into the scheme, because they don't like people eating meat and fish. They say we've got some target to cut down meat consumption by whatever date. This is another of these targets that no one ever agreed to. Most people didn't even hear about. Like, apparently we're going to go smoke free by 2030. Like, where was a referendum on that? So yeah, apparently we've made a pledge in the good times to cut meat consumption by 30% or whatever, and this goes against it. But it's a good example of the slippery slope, isn't it? Because this thing hasn't even come in yet. There's talk about, or at least rumours that the government actually is going to reconsider it because it's such a bad look to be banning people from taking advantage of cheap deals on food at a time when people's living standards are going down. But these guys in their ivory tower, they don't see it. The state-funded NGOs just go, well, we've got our priorities here and it's going meat-free and stopping people eating fish because there's not enough fish. So why not include it in this totally unrelated piece of legislation? The legislation, bad as it is, at least had some sort of concrete goal. It was to reduce childhood obesity. And children probably aren't actually getting obese from eating roast lamb, I shouldn't think. So that's been kind of left out of it. But this mission creep means that actually, if we're going to, as a society, start banning the promotion of certain products for childhood obesity, let's ban them for other reasons as well. Of course they've done that. This is how it works. This is 6 months before the thing's even due to come in, and already the vultures are circling, going, right, we found a weak government here that's going to start banning things because of single-issue pressure groups, and probably Boris and Carrie are, easy meat on in this regard. And so it never stops. And yet again, it's an example of why you just need to oppose this stuff from day one.
And Brendan, how can those two things coexist? Well, on the one hand, you have a lot of understandable concern about what's going to happen to people at the very bottom of the income scale as a result of everything that's going on in the economy. And yet these policies are still there. There's still new ones coming in. The kind of, I guess, the nanny state paternalism, which always hits the people at the bottom hardest, seems just impervious to these other concerns. Why is that, do you think?
I just think it's the otherworldliness of the elites. They just live on a different planet than the rest of us, and so they don't even see the contradiction. They don't even see the contradiction of the fact that we are living in a cost of living crunch, which lots of people are worried about, and their continuing demands to make food more expensive. That's essentially what they're saying. Make people pay more for their weekly shop. And the thing about the meat question that I find really depressing is that eating meat is generally a sign that you are getting wealthier. And if society is eating more meat, that's a positive sign. If you look at China, for example, over the past 40 years, meat consumption in China has risen sevenfold because people have got more money. They've got more choice. They
Stop eating bats.
Right. They don't just have to live on rice and all the other stuff that they kind of subsisted on for so long. There's a great graph somewhere in relation to Ireland and just the shifting nature of food consumption in Ireland from carbs, i.e. potatoes.
I'm glad you said it first. Yeah.
Potatoes, spuds, through to more and more protein being introduced into the diet in the late 1800s and then really from the mid 1900s onwards, which is great because it means that if the potato crop fails, maybe a million people won't die this time. So the consumption of meat is usually a very good signifier that society is moving in the right direction. So this hostility to cheap meat, this hostility to meat eating in general, I think is incredibly regressive. But in relation to your point, Tom, I think the fact that we have a society at the moment where on the one hand, we're worried about energy provision and the energy crisis and the rising cost of living. But on the other hand, the elites are still saying, well, we can't have nuclear and we've got to look to wind. And also we can't have cheap meat and cheap fish and cheap foodstuffs and we have to hike the prices up a little bit or make sure that people don't just waste their money on that stuff. I think that is a perfect snapshot of how out of touch so many of the people who run society or run these NGOs really are, that they don't understand either the huge macro problems facing society or the individual choices that hard up people need to make.
But they're going to get nowhere with this campaign, quite clearly, right? There's no way Boris Johnson is going to say this year, or probably any year, but especially this year, we're going to make it more expensive to get meat. I'm not sure you even get that many 2-for-1 deals on fish and meat anyway, so it's probably a bit of a distraction. But these kind of policies, the childhood obesity policy, a lot of the net zero stuff, these are the policies of the good times when things seem to be going all right and you can afford to luxuriate in feel-good and fairly unrealistic policies. And then when you get to the bad times, it's like, well, this is too expensive and it's going to hurt people too much. And it's like, well, why don't we not hurt people at all? Even in the good times. It's an acknowledgement, really, that these things have an excessive cost on people. They punish people. And you can only do it if you feel that everyone's doing great. Well, there's never a time when everyone's doing great. There's always a time when people are struggling. It comes back to my point before, really. We need to be striving for economic growth. You compare us to somewhere like America. We are so much poorer than America. There's no reason for us to be poorer than America. And America isn't by any means the richest country in the world. I can mention plenty of others. We're nowhere near Sweden's level. You get people like Owen Jones go on Question Time going, we're the fifth richest economy in the world. We're the fifth biggest economy in the world. We've got a very big population. By that measure, Luxembourg's like the 100th richest country in the world. You've got to take account of the number of people living in the country. On per capita basis, we're about the 30th richest country in the world. There's 29 or so countries that are significantly richer than us. It's not good enough. We should be striving for more. Our growth since 2007 has been absolutely pathetic. We're looking at 2 decades of essentially no growth. And I don't know how much longer younger people in particular are going to stand for it. It's an absolute scandal, but you still don't hear very much from politicians, or certainly not from NGOs, about how we're going to dig ourselves out of this hole. And we're not trying to do anything, magical. Lots of other countries have found a way of getting growth, but we won't get it because we're a high tax, low growth, high regulation economy. That's basically the problem.
So let's move on to our final topic, which I wish could say was slightly more upbeat.
It's quite a grim episode.
It is, unfortunately. It's one of those days. Let's talk about Batley Grammar. So it's been a year since the Batley Grammar School scandal, where at this school in Yorkshire, a teacher in a religious studies class showed cartoons from Charlie Hebdo of the Prophet Muhammad, caused this huge controversy where you had loads of essentially Islamist protesters bust in to protest outside the school gates. He was suspended. He was denounced by various people. He went into hiding. And the revelation this week, roughly a year on from all of that, is that he's still in hiding. He still hasn't returned to his job or to his home. Brendan, what do you make of all of this?
I mean, it is depressing. There's no way around it. It's very depressing that in Britain in 2022, someone has to go into hiding for a year simply for showing an image of a religious figurehead to his pupils in class, in a discussion, by the way, about blasphemy and freedom of speech and all those kinds of issues.
You didn't just think they'd be interested.
No, it was part of that kind of discussion. And horrific in so many ways, but I think and it is an anniversary worth marking in some ways, precisely because he's still in hiding. That's what makes it really concerning. And I think when I look back on the Batley Grammar controversy, I think the most shocking thing is not really the behavior of the Islamists outside the school, because they always behave like that. They're always turning up at things and shouting, and they go from protest to protest, and they wagging their fingers and waving their placards, behead those who insult Islam, all that. They always do that stuff. That's what you expect. It would be odd if they did anything different. The real failure was on the part of the institutions of society, which you would expect to defend a school teacher like this. So the teaching unions didn't do a good job of defending him. Local politicians in the area basically applauded the school for addressing the issue quite quickly, in this instance by suspending the teacher for a period of time and wringing their hands over the fact that an image of Muhammad had been shown to school children. And the commentariat and the political class didn't come out and say this teacher ought to have the right to discuss these issues with his pupils and ought not to have to go away into hiding because of the threat of religious fundamentalists. So it was the failure of those institutions in a supposedly liberal society, which is the most shocking thing. And particularly as it came around the same time as the Samuel Paty beheading. Now, that's obviously an incredibly depressing thing to talk about, but it is, there is a situation in Western Europe, it seems, where school teachers are not safe if they go into their classroom and say, listen, kids, let's talk about Muhammad and blasphemy and freedom of speech. And my view is that they should be perfectly safe and perfectly at liberty to do those things. And a society in which they are not safe or at liberty to do those things has gone a bit wrong.
It was interesting as well, because I think it was a few months after that, you had Naz Shah, a Labour MP, get up in Parliament in the debates around the policing bill, which has a specific thing in it about desecrating statues, essentially making the case for a blasphemy law quite explicitly, saying that in the same way that people get very upset when people scrawl racist on the plinth of Churchill statue, that again, the depiction and the blaspheming against the prophet has the same impact. And it was just interesting, that kind of passed without much comment. And it does feel like on this particular issue, you do just have this blasphemy law by the back door and this lack of appreciation that, particularly in many European countries for obvious reasons, it's blasphemy on which, and the right to blaspheme, which is the basis of freedom of speech in all of these various different countries. Yet it was so interesting how quickly it's been forgotten, how easily, not just the Labour Party, but the Tory Party as well, just wanted this to go away. There was obviously the Batley by-election where you'd assume this would become a big issue, and despite some attempts to introduce it into the discussion, that just completely fell flat. The main candidates just tried to ignore it, basically. But it's just another depressing reflection, I guess, of the fact that across the political spectrum, people just don't really care about freedom of speech. You know, you can have a few Tory politicians getting up and talking about wokery and getting some retweets as a result of that. But when push comes to shove, they're nowhere to be seen. Chris, it's pretty depressing, isn't it?
Yeah, everything's depressing. Have you not noticed? Everything's so depressing. That's why people were so keen to talk about the Will Smith thing. Seriously, it was the first bit of banter that we'd had for months. You know, everything's been so bloody grim. So this is, I mean, my position on this is fairly straightforward. Is that, you know, if you don't like teachers talking about blasphemy and showing pictures of the prophet, this is not the country for you. And everybody should have said that at the time. And the reason that they didn't is because they were basically scared. And I don't end up like David Amos. That's the bottom line. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows that, you know, these are our values. And it's insane for a school in Yorkshire to be suspending somebody for showing pictures of Muhammad while giving a talk about blasphemy. Not deliberately trying to wind anybody up, but even if he was trying to wind somebody up, you know, which still doesn't deserve death threats. But people don't do it because they're scared. They're scared, and this has gone on for a very long time, and they have a reason to be scared because people do get killed. And the Danish cartoon guy's been on the run, I think, for any number of years. I went to see him speak at a libertarian conference in can't remember where it was, somewhere in Europe. And, you know, there was armed police there, and everybody was searched before they went in. This is a bunch of students. It was Students for Liberty event. I was one of the older people there. This guy, you know, is being properly lying low Salman Rushdie style. I hope this teacher, I don't know exactly what his circumstances are. I would hope that he could just move abroad, well, not abroad, but move some distance away and start teaching again. But I don't know how sincere these death threats are, and if people are genuinely going to track the guy down. If that's the case, then his life is pretty much finished. And I'm glad we're talking about it, actually, because it reminds us of one of the many kind of casualties of these kind of things, where it's a story for a few days and then it gets forgotten about, and somebody is just left there picking up the pieces.
Brendan, Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support the show, why not become a Spiked supporter? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.